question is, what does the pandemic teach? Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us. I am here via Zoom with our Divisional Dean of the Humanities at Yale, Kathryn Lofton. Katie Lofton, I should say, is also the author of 2 books and myriad articles around religiosity in unexpected places in American life, let's put it that way, including the books Oprah and Consuming Religion, and also a professor of religious studies and American studies. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I've been eager to talk to you because this is a moment for really thinking about meaning and how people make meaning. And I would love to hear your reflections on that. I was reminded, as I was preparing for this discussion, I was thinking about something that Paul Fussell once said about World War II. He said, if the war didn't kill you, it was get you thinking. And I feel that way about the pandemic. And so I'm just eager to hear your reflections. I mean, you've been out in the world more than most people I know because of the work that you do. You've been in contact with a lot of people. You've been on your bicycle out and around town between home and the office. You've seen the world in ways that many of us have not as we've been on lockdown. But you're also someone who's thought a lot about how human beings make meaning. So I would just love to hear, we can start with your general reflections on the pandemic and this moment, and then we can take it from there.
I find myself flitting even more than normal between many different possible vantages to see things from. And because I'm an administrator, those vantages are louder to me than they would be if I was just in my nerd place. And when I'm in my nerd life, I've been doing a collaborative project with colleagues at Notre Dame, University of Michigan, and the University of Chicago with NORC and AP doing surveys about religious reactions to the crisis, which I'll get into. But so one part of me has been asking with my colleagues questions to people surveyed about who they think is responsible for the crisis, how it's affected their religious behavior. So we're getting back information on both theodicy and on sociology of religion. So the nerd person is getting all kinds of interesting information that doesn't really contest with our normal assumptions, but does highlight just the existential threat of the moment. But as a person who does move around this particular city, which is so rich with pretty significant inequality, one is also struck by who needs to be on the street and who does not, who has, in some sense, the privilege, however complicated, of being quarantined and who does not. And there's the various levels of who has the right to worry about how protected they are. And someday a great essay will be written about mask wearing and who thinks they must and who doesn't, and who's the most frightened of being called out for not wearing a mask, who is the most frightened that if they don't, they'll contract something, and the racial and class politics of that. So in all of it, it feels both that everything in our late capitalist moment is being excessively highlighted. My own instinct as a scholar is to say nothing has been illuminated we didn't know. It's just perhaps more people now see it than before, which is, I think, positive political moment, but maybe it also kind of with a lot of grief in my heart, in some instances too late. So that if you have the mayor of New York finally changing his policing practices, but just because he knows he can't control the police, that for me feels like a moment of both good, but also disturbing. Where are we now where we don't even know what the law is? So that's a very general set of reactions, but it's just to outline my own sense that the anthropology of the everyday seems to highlight things that scholars have been yelling about for years. And as a scholar, I think we're just getting more and more data back about how dispiriting and frightening this moment is for people.
Yeah. Let's start with that project. What are some of the questions and what are some of the things that are bouncing back as you explore religion and religiosity at this moment?
Well, one thing that was kind of exciting, but also somewhat dispiriting to realize that we had started this research project before COVID. As anyone who's ever done this kind of data thing, it takes months to get the time with the respondents and with NORC. And so we've been working on it for a long time and we've changed gears quickly. But the theme we had planned to go in with was on religious freedom and the question of the status of religious freedom as a concept for Americans. We really wanted to look especially questions of vaccine in the wake of the bake shop case. We wanted to go check in with Americans on what they thought about religious freedom. And what was so interesting from that data, and then we quickly drafted a new survey about COVID, was what a small minority of Americans agree with these small minority of protesters who think it's a threat to their religious freedom for us to be needing to practice social distancing and quarantine as it relates to congregational practice. A tiny number. And this is a survey across political spectrum, equal parts left and right, across the denominational spectrum and theological spectrum. So it's just always striking to be reminded what an outsized presence extreme voices have in our media. But if you proportionally actually covered these protests about religious freedom that have been happening in courthouses, which are also obviously also protests about economic involvement, certain dissent from the very fact that we're being socially controlled at all by the imagined left media. But if you made that proportional, that's something like 1 in 1,000 people thinks that that's a right view. And yet if you watch the media, you think this is an incredibly loud portion of Americans. So one thing that's disturbing, and that they strongly feel that religious freedom is a value that you weigh out with other kinds of freedom, and is quite like and equitable with the concept of public health. So for example, we found that the same small portion of Americans think that the right not to vaccine as a parent should be seen as a religious freedom. Indeed, most Americans, a vast majority, much stronger across evangelical to left Christians, Jews, Muslims, all think vaccination is a public health right, and therefore should not be seen as an exempted quality under religious freedom law.
Before we get to the 199 out of 1,000, let's focus on the 1 out of 1,000 for a minute. In religious and philosophical terms, how do you understand those folks who seem to be willing to put themselves at risk for what they believe? How do you understand who those people are who are out on the courthouse steps in Michigan or well, now, I mean, really all over the country?
What I would love to do to expand the survey would be to find out if the thing I'm about to say is sociologically accurate, but I'm going to wager, just as a cultural studies person, that it might be accurate, that I have a couple brilliant doctoral students working on the kind of falsity of wellness culture, the way that wellness culture has entered a religious discourse. A student, Cody Musselman, looking particularly at fitness regimes and how they have become so predominant in the spiritual identity of Americans. And with that, she's really diagnosed all this incredible journalism that's gone on debunking things like the Goop Project, in which there's a lot of, by certain scientific measures, false claims about the body. Mm-hmm. So call it a left form of scientific dissent, so that they say regular medicine has been sexist and abused women's bodies, so we're going to follow the celebrity whose recommendations might produce her embodiment. I'm here, you see, drawing a pair, because if we think only in terms of a kind of radical right politics, I think we miss the ways in which a disbelief in science does cross the spectrum. Yes. And which holding that down always has economic ends and a political critique. So that the critique is what holds in common Gwyneth Paltrow with right protesters in Ohio, is a sense establishment medicine is pretty messed up, which it turns out a lot of people in between agree, since we see such a strong number of people saying, no, we should have a different kind of medical healthcare system and a way to finance it. So that the common sense is something's not treating me well specifically, but then how fervently you take that, how outside the system you want to be, I think depends on one's own social proclivities and capacity to survive the stigma attached with being such a radical. I'm deep in the Hilary Mantel series about Tudor England right now, and that's of course the time in which Protestants were burned for being Protestant. And history, a lot of Protestants in America would say those were the bravest people in the world. But if you're deep in the Mantel novels, which are done through the voice of this very secular rationalist Thomas Cromwell, they seem like these protesters in Ohio. They seem like madmen, or like Gwyneth Paltrow.
It is fascinating. There is this strange zone where the right and the left meet on certain questions.
My language would be something like they spiritually meet. And the way I mean that is that if you sat with them, the fervency of a sense that the world does not see what hurt them and what their critique has substance in. It sounds to us only like, really? You're going to send an unvaccinated kid to my kid's daycare? No, you're not. But they say, do you know how bad the hospital hurt me? Do you know how bad it hurt my grandma? And when you get into those stories, you think, yeah, that's human. I think there's other answers to it besides that. But one can see that the sense of you're not being heard and needing to scream louder, that's what I'm likening to those radical Protestants. Whoever's asking, why are you burning? Just tell them that you believe in the God. They're like, I can't tell them that. That's a lie. It's a sort of intensity of kind of affective energy.
Yeah. So what about the other 999? What is your group finding about them in this moment?
What's really interesting is how divided they are about the kind of governance that would make, and this is very obvious to any political observer, but really how divided politically we are, and how our religion, again, this is not surprising to me as a scholar, but our religious differences and our political differences are almost just simultaneous. And for a long time, there's been a strong movement in secularism studies to argue we should see denominational categories as political categories more than theological categories. Theology is a way of talking about and organizing power. So it's meaningful to think about sectarian debates and why Lutherans and Presbyterians see themselves as radically different, but it's so often been a social and political category of difference. And anyway, I'm getting into the weeds. What I want to highlight is that the differences come up on who gets to decide the case of religious freedom, who gets to decide who's to blame for this present crisis. And that's where that kind of strong majority, over 70%, starts looking like 43 or 44% differences. So for example, in the study that we did about causes of COVID-19, over 80% felt that God was trying to tell us something. When we asked them what they thought that this was trying to teach them and gave them a variety of options, the strongest unity was something called God is trying to tell this country something about what it's doing, and it should change its ways. When we get into the weeds, though, what are those ways? Well, we had another question that asked them to think of who's to blame for the coronavirus. And something like 42% blamed foreign governments. Something like 33% blamed the United States government. 9% blamed immigrants. You get into a very weedy territory, and that's where you see the kind of political divide that I think is reflected in our Fox versus MSNBC world.
Right. So there are very predictable red state and blue state answers.
There's not a lot of diversity there, but I, of course, am interested because I'm a student of mass culture. It interests me that first, that we still have such a strong number of Americans claiming belief in God. That's 80% say yes to that category. And then within that, to be clear, that has nothing to do with congregational obedience because only 51% of Americans claim any kind of even minimal level of congregational alignment. So belief in God supersedes that. But that within that language of God feels so directive in this moment. I'm interested in that there's some power beyond this that is trying to instruct us on how to rethink our world. To me, that's exciting to think about what kind of popular movements or mass cultural objects could unify that intensity. But as you and I know so well from the scholarly world, it turns out people really then get in a squabble about, now, who are we going to organize to ask and think through the problem of God? And some people want that to be very local and individual and familial, and some want that to be structural and politicized at the level of government.
It's interesting. One of the things that I've been thinking about just these last few days is that one of the ironies of this moment that we're in seems to require a localism, which is not necessarily our thing as a society. It seems like anything good that can be woven out of this moment has to really happen at the local level. And we're seeing pockets of that. I think that certain localities would include some of the things that our mayor has done. But because so many people are on lockdown one sort or another, an even larger percentage of the population than normal. And so the Fox-ness and MSNBC-ness of the world is actually getting highlighted at this moment, the way that local social fabrics have been torn asunder. Do you feel that?
It's such a beautiful thought that for a lot of Americans, their imagination is now controlled by what's mediated, which is a very national story, in a moment where we are reiterating as a country the incredible central role in organizing the safety and education of its citizens at the state level. Anyone who studies questions of equity in national politics knows that we need federal government or else there will be only grotesque inequality in this country. On the other hand, we're being reminded so powerfully right now that justice does usually come, jurisprudence, a single case, a local case that gets worked through and fights its way up to the federal courts, but also that governors have a much better sense of regionalism. As an administrator, I'm also really aware the push and pull between, I want central power to tell me what to do, but as you and I are champions of what we call faculty governance, that we want the faculty the right to speak back and organize. But they also want to be told some sense of constraint and restrictions. In lived reality, we're finding that inevitably it is going to be the faculty to decide because they actually know the anthropology of the everyday. They know what it means to run a residential college. So what I note is we need the knowledge of the granular to make any kind of reasonable leaderly decisions. But not dissimilar to the person who's stuck at home and can't get out in the world. How can you know that granular if your information is so centralized? And in every meeting I'm in, I'm struck by how we need to have better, richer stories of the local to make any reasoned justice, administratively, nationally, or at the level of the governance that we're in. But I'm also reminded, as I know you know so well, that universities are villages of their own. They're governments within governments within governments. And we know well in the state of Connecticut, just a really outsized role Yale plays in both the economy and the political life of the state. But that Yale itself functions as a place of residence, nurturance, home, healthcare for a very large aura of humans whose desires to have connection to that institution are deeply vexed, and not simple lines of, oh, I want to go to there. It's also, I'm frustrated by that. I want my freedom. I want protection from it. And standing in the middle of that quagmire, I don't just have sympathy for our political leaders. I also demand, why are our political leaders not being more interested in? These are the very politics that should shape the best policy.
Mm-hmm. When we started out, you were saying, and I totally agree with you, that present moment puts under a magnifying glass some of the things that we already knew about our society and its failings. And they become more apparent because they become more matters of life and death. So the inequalities for a generation and more are just suddenly so stark, so visible, and so fraught with just a kind of heightened stakes involved. I'm curious, though, are there certain things that you've seen in the last couple of months that have surprised you or that are prodding you to think in ways that you hadn't thought about society, our culture, the way that human beings behave, the way we believe?
As a slightly cynical child of the left, how complicatedly I feel in relationship to the category of ritual. So ritual, if you read any sociology of religion or any sociological theory, really, there is no sociological theory that describes society that does not also have a theory of ritual. So how do I know I'm in a society? I do certain things to join it, to participate in it, to be honored in it. And in the secular West that we occupy, the common images of that are things like graduation ceremonies, weddings, and funerals.
Yes.
And I became quite obsessed with and ended up writing something about the fact that these mass graves in Hart Island right now don't have any funerary rites. And when I read about that, I thought, well, maybe that, and this is so the impulsive administrator, I bet it's for reasonable, practical reasons that they don't do it. And I started reading all this forensic science research online, and I found there actually is a strong recommendation because there's a lot of literature about exhumation of mass graves, especially in issues of terrorism and violence, how you can give reconciliation to the lost people. But that even in that, they give strong advice that if a mass grave is necessary due to a natural disaster or a medical health crisis, that there are absolutely ways to insert some form of funerary rite. I started doing historical research and found out in the early medieval period, we have in Germany all kinds of ample archaeological evidence that they were able to provide, even in a moment of recognized public health crisis. And so why am I, a person for whom I've never gone to a single graduation, weddings I did at courthouses, what is my relationship? I'm also obsessed with the disturbing fact. And it seems to me that the fact that we don't have a way of doing a funeral also means we don't have a way of having a society we want to honor, since funeral is a moment to honor the dead and recognize the societal loss of not having that person, but also that we will rebuild from it because there's a societal concept that pre and post exists, that horrible loss. And not having it feels to me like some very powerful metonym for the absent feeling that society, and this is not just of COVID, I think this is about what critics of capitalism have been yelling about for years. It's a very specific thing, and the race for the pursuit of wealth has left behind a vast middle, such that it's easy to toss one body after the other and simply say, this is just what we have to do. No, it isn't. We didn't have to do that. And in previous years, even on Hart Island, they incorporated funerary rites when they were doing mass burials. So to me, there's something here that I would never in this moment be simply optimistic. This will teach us something. I actually don't know if we have a lot of evidence that we know how to learn as a society together. When I'm with our students in Yale College, I think, it's going to be okay because they're so alive and aware and critically fighting. But when I face the economy that they then have to assert themselves into to survive, it's hard to imagine how we can fight for the pause and social reckoning that I think needs to happen.
So I find myself, I have all kinds of questions tumbling out of what you just said. One has to do with funerals and death and the kind of mass death that we're experiencing. As we speak today, 93,000 people have passed away in this country alone in really just about 2 months. But they've done so pretty much invisibly,
Yes.
Right? There's very little that marks it in any way. There's been no public mourning. Because we have a president who just absolutely does not speak in particular ways, we haven't been called together, really, to note this or to mark it in any particular way. And then that's added to by the fact that we're sequestered, and by design we're sequestered. I'm curious how you, given your expertise, how you would understand and articulate the social costs of that.
So the expendable bodies of capitalism is a subject well traversed in Black studies and predicts capitalism, the sense that bodies are just another form of energy for the system, and their loss is simply to be noted as a loss of fuel or a loss of food. Why would you honor that? You wouldn't honor that death with any funeral. You simply say the energy has been lost. Too bad. Maybe the economy needed it. It just needed it. That's the very bleak version. To me, something I got caught up in searching this question of ritual was the fact that the Rabbinical Council of America decided to make a decree that allowed for remote minyan when doing the mourner's Kaddish, which, as you know, is particularly requires the physical presence of a certain number of mourners. So it says to its conservative congregations, it's okay. If someone dies, you can do the mourner's Kaddish by Zoom. Notably to me, as you know so well too, there's a very congregational spirit in Judaism that those councils are advisory but not legally required. You know, it's not a question, as one often imagines, Roman Catholicism, if something comes as a papal decree, it has to be followed out throughout the bureaucracy of Roman Catholic congregational life. No, in Judaism, it's advisory to rabbis who have a strong individual ability to interpret. And I found out a lot of local conservative rabbis are saying that they're refusing that edict because they worry that if once we go digital, why would we ever go back to in person? The fear that it's a slippery slope that you must maintain. So the mourner's Kaddish is being deferred. And there was a rabbi in San Francisco that said, now is not the time for the mourner's Kaddish. In Jewish history, we have long deferred it to the right moment to honor. And as I read that quote, I felt both rage and understanding and rage. Right, a ritual does deserve a particular moment of togetherness and physical togetherness. We agree, especially those of us who endeavor to remote teach and to remote relate, know that this isn't the same. On the other hand, it feels also like acceding something to not grab onto the moment ritually, and especially given the incredibly important role that the mourner's Kaddish plays in processing grief over a particular liturgical moment of time. So I can just jump back and forth on that. I simply note that these are human level decisions. Even those bodies going into the mass grave, I'm sure many of us saw the piece in the Times of the woman who worked in the hospital and put a daffodil or a flower into every body bag that she passed. That's a human being, an individual person deciding, I'm not letting this body pass without recognition. So as much as we rightly indict structures and administrative powers of politics, I'm interested in that individual level discernment. The council makes a decree, and individuals work through that decree and resolve somewhere else. How do we intimately decide otherwise? Obviously, I have a politics where I think we should try to account for this. My job as a scholar to try to reckon with, and I see you see I'm giving a slightly inadequate answer. Why don't they do it? I understand I don't. Do
you share my own assumption that part of the fallout here is going to be that PTSD on a massive scale? That the lack of any healing at all, or even the opportunity for healing, is just like we're racking up some societal deficit that is just gonna, who knows how it's gonna manifest, but that it's really accruing. Do you feel that?
I do. I came across this pretty significant longitudinal study of Cambodian families who had lost people in the Khmer Rouge, and the analysis of their survival of that trauma, and just the mass distribution of significant symptoms, including the phrase PTSD is right. That's what brought these clinicians into this longitudinal study of them, was to find out, how do you survive mass trauma? And this seemed like an organized and smaller group of people to do that with significant experience of trauma. And what they found is, almost no Western medical answers seem to suffice to provide resolution to traumatic dreams, day sweats, constant feelings of frenzy, in Western medicine we call anxiety. And what was interesting to these researchers, who were not scholars of religion, was that the only habits that seemed to solve the PTSD were Buddhist rituals, where they either marked the merit of the dead in the ways that Buddhism has a lot of significant rituals to help individuals mark those who have passed and what their merits were, to keep their memory alive and pass them forward into the spirit life with strength, to have the ritual Day of the Dead be more enunciated and significant for a local community's calendar, and in general meditative practice in which you thought and concentrated on the individuals who were lost rather than try to forget them. And I think what moved me about that data, which is on one hand, it's about religion being actually a more functional healer for a certain religious ritual. But as a scholar, I'm interested also that they're acts of concentration, that our job, and here it seems to me, this is our obligation. How can we put these names, these stories, that the great rallying cry of the Black Lives Matter movement, say my name, say their name, like say the name and say that name over and over, as the Mortis Cottage instructs, say the name, may their memory be a blessing. How can we not forget? Well, not forgetting requires concentration, of which academic and humanistic scholarship of the many descriptions of it one could be, so we don't forget and we honor those who have been lost. And my only hope here is, it's not hope, it's I trust the practices of humanism to function. Those work alongside practices of religion. I have no doubt that doctors who can provide psychiatric care, but that's an elite possibility. What moved me about the Khmer Rouge study is that this is a territory where the medical accessibility of psychiatric care is not abundant. And in the absence of that, what was even more healing anyway, even for that small segment who got it, was to socially recognize the dead.
So maybe to amplify that a little bit, I was struck, and I totally share your sense that the calamity of the last 2 months is deeply rooted in a history that's pretty familiar to anyone who's studied capitalism, who has studied Black studies, the expendability of human life. That is exactly the story of the 18th century plantation. That is exactly the story of the 19th century factory. And U.S. Steel was happy to throw a certain number of Czech or Polish bodies into the furnace. That's the cost of doing business. And that's what the Industrial Revolution was, whether it was in England in the 18th century, the US in the 19th century, or China in the 20th. That's what capitalism looks like. Do you see a way out of this? Is there a way that our intense experience of the pandemic itself and the ways that it's pulled the curtain back for ordinary folks who haven't necessarily thought of things in these terms as much as historians or sociologists might? Is there a way that there's a renewed opportunity? Are you finding any optimism at all in what you're seeing unfolding?
I keep on being asked for development for optimistic account. I keep saying, well, I think very gloomy poetry is optimistic, that someone's writing. I myself always incline ontology as one of cheer and survival, but emerges from a knowing of deep suffering. So in the fall, I taught a class called How to Build an American Religion, and the intention for that class was to turn a lot of courses I had in kind of popular culture and religion and sexuality into a more programmatic, okay, let's do it. Let's build some American religions. And you know well just the history of American utopian thinking, which is often a profound critique of labor, family relations, rewriting the code of life within capitalism. Many of those utopias began as groups of people, ended up today being companies that sell flatware. So they don't end up surviving as their sort of parentheses of social practice. They end up, Amana colonies now sell refrigerators in Iowa. There's something that goes, and I, as a student of religion, that's then the thing I'm most interested in, is how does this sort of exciting spiritual energy end up becoming commodified? And there are good reasons for that. That is, when you take up specific instances of utopian dreaming, I've written some about the Herman Miller Company, which had real ambitions to change the world through the kinds of furniture that we have in our home, thinking in ways all of us would agree that the objects you sit on and the things that surround you might change your spirit. And they happen to be from this Dutch Reformed tradition that made strong claims about the relationship. And then they end up designing the office cubicle, which is one of the most indicted objects. Is there anything more? That and Foxconn are the two powerful totems of embodied entrapment in capital. I read recently a piece, a newspaper, just saying a woman wishing she could go back to her cubicle because she said, as a person without religion, being in that network made me feel a part of a monastic cell. So one sees there how we get kind of ensnared, as Zizek says, desire inheres in capitalism. It's so hard to break us from the desire to belong. And that goes for, I have brilliant Marxist students who are yelling at the administration about divestment and yelling at me about how we can support all kinds of systems to change and make more equitable distribution of Yale's resources. But they all own an iPhone. And if we all dumped our iPhones, that would have a much more significant effect on global capital than the divestment of Yale from its fossil fuel resources. Yale should also do that. But the point being that we have to rid ourselves of our own consumer addictions, which is to dig into the deepest parts of our own identity struggles. What is it to be off the grid or to remove yourself? Think about right now all the horrifying stories outside of the meat packing plants. Well, people have been yelling for years about the question of what the meat industry does, how it alters climate change, how it's horrible for reproductive biology, how it has this horrible social labor practices. So now it's just furthering that terrible indictment. And yet every day, I know a lot of people who can't go through a day without eating red meat. I understand it's so essential to their social identity that to give it up. So it seems to me thinking about how we break those addictions would be the beginning to think about how we could break a broader social spectrum of issues. And I could have used, rather than meat packing plants, the other terrifying image, which is, of course, the American prison industry, and how much that also seems to be reproducing some idea of our safety is attached to other people's imprisonment and enslavement. Those are the same people digging the ditches in Hart Island. They're also the most infected population, that is Rikers Island prisoners. How do I break the world of thinking that their safety? That's what interested me so much about de Blasio lifting the policing restrictions. It seems sort of, what if we did lift out the role police play in our society? Would the world fall apart? Would we get more free? All I know is capital is going to be a hard thing to dismiss in that we're too addicted to it.
Right. Yeah, I would put Amazon in this category too.
Yes. I have a raft of cousins who are struggling under the socioeconomic spectrum, and they just make such great cases. They live in rural communities. They have very specific, their children are all at home with them. They need crayons. It's Walmart or Amazon. And these are people who lean towards Walmart politics, but because of their own fear of their physical safety, think, well, I'll go Amazon now. But either way, that's...
Yeah, I am really struggling with that now myself from an ethical standpoint, because as you know, I am totally on lockdown for health reasons. There's nothing that's going to come into this house by me going out and getting it. It's not going to happen. So then it does become this really complicated 21st century question about, is there even an ethical way to get things from outside the house into the house in this setting? And what's the best way to think about that? It's very complicated.
Dorothy Day was so beautiful on these points, but it's very hard to live. You know, the first measure of a moral person is what you're willing to give up. I realize in my own classes, I really want to think about that. The language of sacrifice is often put in the image of heroism, the soldier's sacrifices. But what would it be to intimately decide, I do not need to have that book. I do not need to have that screwdriver. I do not need to have that steak. What is it to decide those? Because it's the standard we've come to imagine we must have to sustain the ongoing reproduction of the capitalist occupation that we have. I relate to so much of my female colleagues who are at home doing parenting issues. They're just in desperate climes because they have small children. They're trying to keep going in academic and intellectual careers that are punishing. And they're like, Uber Eats and Amazon are how I survive. That's an incredibly privileged frame. It's a privileged frame that's required because of the occupation of capital. I participate in that by evaluating them on productivity as scholars. So all the system would have to slow down. I, as a dean, would have to accept a different kind of idea of productivity. They, as consumers, would have to imagine maybe it's just rice and beans and we don't. We would all have to change our desired level. And also, I think our levels of unconsciousness of how, to me, this is the more exciting Marxism, how maybe we've become addicted because we were unhappy and there were things we were doing to fill the space of that, which included things and a certain idea of richness that we could take a step back on. Now, of course, you know so well from teaching format, Depression produced a moment where Americans did that, but there was such a backlash subsequently to the liberal politics that emerged from that austerity regime.
The site of my own little tiny glimmer of optimism is that whatever else you want to say about the arc of the 20th century, it is true that the Depression generation, in collectivity of that cataclysm and the collectivity of trying to do something to resolve it, they came out with a notion of governance that became the kind of common sense for about 2 generations through the middle part of the 20th century. And it's not a bad one as things go. The sense that there are things that the government can do that only government can do is actually a common sense that it's all but lost in the 21st century. I mean, there's some, you have the occasional Bernie Sanders. The common sense of American politics has moved on, starting with the Nixon or the Reagan era. But that sense is rooted in a cataclysm and an experience of collectivity that makes me wonder, is the pandemic another occasion for this gathering? And as we've pulled together to flatten the curve, do we come out of this with a new sense of what the common sense might be? Or are we just going to shrug our shoulders and go back to what it was?
So hard to imagine. The value of equity for all is so not commonly held, and the value of free enterprise is much more commonly held, even by those who also say services for all. So the question of fighting to get a different kind of disaggregate healthcare from employment in this country is just a perfect image. Why is that so hard? It seems so commonsensical to not attach the lives of their citizens to their employment. It says everything about what this country understands as the merit of a human being, that they cannot imagine taking care of them unless they are serving the economy through employment. That, for me, it feels such a broad, and especially in a moment when universities have become politicized as left instruments, even you and I know how profoundly conservative and not especially left they are, but they've been portrayed so passionately as, that is, one could have hope if you thought, again, the post-World War II moment, you had a broad-based support for public education that I think contributed to citizens understanding the role of the general in the life of an individual. And so without that educational system, we're just left to people in front of these TVs receiving these cartoon images in which they want to be a part of free enterprise and not a part of some world where they have to share the stuff with some other person they don't value in another county over. And how do you create a consciousness of public good? In the history of the West, that's usually through messiahs or disasters. We're in a disaster. Are we waiting for a messiah? Well, there's a long tradition of waiting for the person or persons who would come forward and represent the hope that could unite us in a federal concept of care.
Right. Yeah, I should say that little glimmer of hope that I just articulated has already been outdated. It would have been an easier case to make even 6 weeks ago than it is now, because 6 weeks ago, there did seem to be a fairly broad societal consensus that we did want to pull together and flatten the curve. That's no longer the case. We've broken down on that question. And the other thing is, and I thought this was fascinating for about a minute and a half, that even the Republican Party's first economic response to the crisis was a Keynesian one. And they've been allergic to Keynesianism for 2 generations, but their first response was, we have to put together a stimulus package. We have to make this governmental intervention. But that peeled off too, and now we're more in a world of, we're all soldiers, and I'm putting heavy scare quotes on that.
Right, as well, because they weren't willing to make that a repeat option. That is a regular, if they'd been willing to give every month a stimulus package, so monthly for over a course of the next 6 months, we would have been living in a different system. And I want to note, for my part, what's so interesting and not surprising to me is the ways in which, on the one hand, we could say it's the government saying, go back to work because we want this system to get up and running again. I also experience and receive emails every day from people in janitorial, dining, in the staff services. I need to get back to work. I want to be on both at the level of those who are out of work. Our campus, the only people who are out of work are those who are the construction workers on the sites of new building. But everyone else wanting to get back into it. And so I could speak forever about faculty want to get to the library, but that's less interesting to me than people want to get back in, and that sense of that this is a part of my identity. I don't want to be home. I don't want to be paid for doing nothing. That's, to me, that seems also a mindset to break. What are we willing to give up about our self-conception to serve the greater good? Right now, it seems just about nothing. Very little are we willing to give up. So, because this self is more important than any other thing.
Yeah.
And I think the wearing of masks has become, to me, a kind of comic accessory. Are you willing to do this? But even that now, it's a very meaningful thing. We must keep doing it. But if that's the only thing we end up resolving politically or economically doing commons, I'll be pretty dispirited.
And it's dispiriting that that's already become a kind of culture wars marker.
Correct.
So as we wind towards conclusion here, let's go back to one of the early things that you said. You mentioned what you called the anthropology of everyday life. Can you, for those of us who have been locked in our homes for more than 2 months now, can you do a little bit of reporting back on the state of New Haven as you see it, as you ride from your office to home on your bicycle, and some of the encounters you've had? What are you seeing out there in the city in terms of the general welfare, the general morale? We
can tell always a kind of mixed bag of stories. I have this rental office in Fairhaven, and I walk and bike around these streets at night as I'm sort of struggling through my own moral and human quandaries. And there's so many families on their porches and yelling back and forth to each other on other porches, and that sort of sense of kind of fragile twilight social public that was not there 6 months ago, and I was doing the same kind of moral meandering. My torments are persistent, but notably the social public, and then sort of talking back and forth on the street. I experienced some of that in East Rock too, but in East Rock, I think there's a different kind of both a class and culture of quiet and sovereignty and independence. And so I want to link up to like who's doing what work, who has to do the essential work of the city, who has to get in their car and go to work. Those are largely brown and black bodies in the city, and they have a different relationship to the freedom of that this moment affords, where someone I was just talking to on the street the other day was saying, he's like, it's kind of fun to walk these streets without everyone else around, and feeling on the one hand kind of empowered that they occupy the economy in a more central way, on the other hand bearing the deaths and the suffering greater. So there's something that's sort of broken in the social cycle where the streets are less filled with the regular cars, the stores are less filled, but they are operating and moving in ways that kind of indicate both how much we need, especially this particular institution of Yale, to be going on in order to keep open businesses, but also how much its loudness always silences other kinds of communities and voices that are happening. I'm really interested too in the disparity of church obedience and sort of the racial disparity that white churches in New Haven have largely shut down and doing remote services. A lot of brown and black churches are still trying to find ways to function in person with social distancing. And finally, I think just notable that the sense of, as mayors point out, just the decline in crime, the sense that economic strife does often lead to criminal activity, but it's been notable that there's been a significant decline in New Haven. And to me, it's the stories that we tell about what brings out criminal activity are really quite false, as our colleagues J.C. Mears and Elizabeth Hinton would tell us. I just struck by an interesting piece when one of the major engines of capital is quieter and isn't transferring as many bodies. At the same time, there's this large-scale engine of the hospitals, which hit its peak of patients in the second week of April, but has functioned with, frankly, a great deal of care and dignity in this, and has been a signal model for other hospitals across the country in managing this health crisis. And of course, that's filled with New Haven workers and Yale doctors and Yale doctoral students doing their degrees. The history I would love to read is someone who writes the Anthropology, from janitorial staff up to the dean, how that hospital has operated and understood itself as a social community, since it seems to me they have most led forward in thinking ethically about how to care for all in this crisis.
It is extraordinary how carefully and thoughtfully they're controlling the spaces and conveying a sense of safety and confidence to the people who do have to walk through the door there. I think they're doing a fabulous job.
And making clear every patient who goes in there understanding with COVID, they're part of a research model. So the intersection of we're serving public health, we're achieving research mission, and we are available to all. And that sense of that the walk-in for COVID at the Yale New Haven Hospital has been very profound, and a question of how we could make a society that looks a little more like that, knowing, of course, as our colleague Jennifer Klein would point out, just how significantly research hospitals in urban areas have contributed to neighborhood blight and gross inequality. I'm interested in this moment where they have stepped back in all of their clinical care, which is how they make money. So right now, Yale New Haven Hospital is making no money on what it is doing, and yet it is functioning at a very high level towards the social good. It will raise all that money again. Its engine of clinical care will rise up again very, very quickly.
It will revert to its former self.
Correct. But in the meantime, I'm interested in this parentheses where they truly lay down and recreate the entire hospital in about 3 days to serve this purpose, suggesting what if society could also remodel itself.
I find myself thinking about this a lot because, and I'm sure that you've taken part in more of these conversations than even I have, but I feel like I've been in an endless round of conversations about how to step up our pedagogical game on Zoom. How are we going to make Zoom function better for us? And I feel the opposite impulse, like that's fine. Okay, we can do that and we will do that. But what about looking in the other direction and thinking more about a real face-to-face public? What are the ways in which we want to build, not just rebuild the sense of a public that isn't just a virtual public, but maybe even build a public that didn't exist before the pandemic, really thinking about the public square in a way that we as a society had pretty much, with the exception of the Occupy movement, pretty much ceased to think of public square as a meaningful aspect of our life for at least a century. But maybe it's a moment to try to recapture something of, now that we're all hungry, to recapture a sense of that public square and the face-to-face kinds of encounters with our neighbors and strangers and that kind of coming together.
Yeah, how can we honor the fact that when we are together, it is precious and not to be used wastefully with bad agenda? That would be my revision of what you just said. So that in-person interaction should be with the highest purpose. I will say one of the things that struck me about Zoom, and I know we've talked about this as it relates to the FAS Senate meetings, is how it increases participation. And here we're reminded that people have a variety of home circumstances that make it often easier to join a meeting if they can do it from their home. And we've had much higher democratic participation at Yale governance, at least, in many different registers, whether student activism, staff participation in meetings, faculty votes, all because we're being equitable. Now, you could say it's also because we're all sequestered and unable to travel, but notably to me, as you know, it's been long prohibited, for example, to have remote voting on a tenure case. And it would really raise a lot of ethical questions if we truly allow that for the long term. But I note that we're having much more robust presence. And in large meetings for faculty, we've also been allowed to include staff in a way we never have before, instructional faculty we never have before, because we're never asking the question about the size of the room. And I'm excited to ask, how can we have different room size conceptions, so that Zoom might be a tool we used forward, allowing people a different way of staging their life? Not to mention, it's also invited for our staff community the possibility of remote work from home, which the union has been arguing for years. Yeah. And I think we've found among our staff that there's been no abatement of their capacity to serve us. The only thing that has been is technological needs, which we needed to supply. But what would it be to recognize a more humane work-life balance and increased level of governance participation? Wow, I think we just discovered a positive tool for that.
That's true. That's interesting. Is there anything we haven't talked about the current moment that you feel that we should have?
It's interesting, the question of federal government and what it stands in for in this time. I think we can't tell, and I admit I find too often the op-ed culture around it so extreme and reactive. We can't quite see it's normal. I am so struck, though, by the opportunity it leads to have other kinds of leadership step forward. And I'll be interested to watch in American politics who among the governors, Ohio, Oregon, New York, California, will be seen as different kinds of tested field leaders for future government participation in electoral politics. We know that we're in a kind of absurd reality television version of American national politics, but that turns out that reality TV show doesn't only need to include former reality TV stars. Other people have stepped forward here. Not people I necessarily agree with their politics, but what would an American political life look like if Cuomo enters the race? What does that look like? How does that change the conversational capacity? Since I think we now have battle-tested governors and a different idea of suffering and survival.
Yes, and certainly as dysfunctional as the federal government has proved itself to be, and governance at the state level has actually really stepped up and proven itself in this cycle, and it has convinced a lot of non-believers in the importance of government as an instrument of, the public good and public will.
As a Wisconsin native, my heart breaks at its current traumas on this question, but it never has shown more important why the University of Wisconsin Law School must be a supported and funded aspect of whatever persistence of that university is, why it's so important for people to run for state legislatures. So just like after the Trump election, we saw a new ignited interest in democratic participation, since I think for those of us in Gen X, electoral participation just seems like a futile participation in the absurdities of patriarchal power that you're never going to win anyway. I am excited to see a new generation who's less cynical about power simply because they don't have the luxury of such cynicism, that their neoliberals just won't be protected if they just stand away, and to see what it would be to step forward and change the shape of who's running for office. There's no doubt, though, by raising Wisconsin, I do think we have the challenge of red states getting further and further from the coastal states' politics and interest. What will it take to break this country into two countries? I think that feels to me right now a not naive or absurd question to raise.
I've been saying for 2 decades, and it's even more pronounced at this moment, that if red state America and blue state America, if those truly were sectional geographical units, that we probably would have started a civil war a long time ago.
Yeah.
But the divisions are too messy for that to happen. But it's extraordinary. And Trump already, I don't know if you saw this in the paper this morning, but he's made outright, overt public comments about his support of certain states that were really just like the bid he made to the leader of Ukraine. Basically, I want a favor, though. If you're going to get any of the goods that the federal government has title to, you're going to have to support me in my election. You're just going to have to. And if you don't, your state is going to suffer, and your people are going to die. Our government has become more and more Soviet, ever since the Berlin Wall fell down. The story of American history since the fall of the Berlin Wall is the story of our government becoming more and more Soviet.
The positive part of that is it leads the resistance to get more overt, so that maybe we were all compelled to a euphemism of civil politics, of politeness, and of acceptance because it contributed to our capitalist end to do so. But I appreciate that now we have, just as we can accuse the right of becoming more and more grotesque in its overt politics, so has the left gotten more technical and detailed in naming what an alternative future might be. we need that loud language to prohibit ourselves from truly becoming a state like the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, Dean Lofton, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're one of the busiest, or maybe the busiest person at our university, so we really appreciate your taking the time for this conversation. It's always enlightening to talk to you, so thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. You know that, Matthew Fry. Thank you very much.
Thank you.